The silence had been her closest companion for so long that Mara no longer noticed it most days. It settled into her bones the way dust did, quietly, patiently, until it felt like part of her. Morning after morning, she woke before the sun, listening to the faint creak of the roof beams as the night cooled away, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind brushing the dry grass outside. There was no voice calling her name, no footsteps crossing the floor. Just the land and her, bound together by necessity rather than affection. Her adobe house sat alone at the edge of the valley, far enough from the nearest settlement that weeks could pass without another human in sight. When she had first come here, people told her she wouldn't last. A woman alone had no place this far from protection, they said. But they hadn't known what it was like to lose everything. They hadn't understood that loneliness could feel safer than grief. She had arrived nearly 10 years earlier, following the shallow hope that distance might dull the pain of her husband's disappearance. He had ridden east with a freight caravan, promising to return before winter. Winter had come and gone. So had spring. No body, no letter, no word, only rumors swallowed by the trail. After waiting until hope turned brittle, Mara sold what little she had left and rode west until the land felt as empty as she did. Life here had been hard, but honest. She learned how to mend fences, draw water from the well, hunt small game, and shoot straight when it mattered. The days followed simple patterns, and the nights were mercifully quiet. Over time, she convinced herself she preferred it this way. No attachments meant no more losses. That illusion shattered the afternoon the ground began to tremble. She was outside splitting wood when the sound reached her, low and distant at first, like thunder without clouds. She paused, axe resting against the stump, and listened. The rhythm grew heavier, more deliberate. Hooves, many of them. Her heart kicked sharply against her ribs. No travelers came this way anymore. The trade routes had shifted south, and soldiers avoided the valley unless ordered through. She set the axe down slowly and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. The riders appeared over the ridge in a loose line, dust swirling around them like smoke. 7 men, broad and tall, mounted on powerful horses streaked with sweat and dirt. Their silhouettes cut starkly against the pale sky, and even from a distance, Mara knew who they were. Comanche. Stories she had heard years ago surged back, whispered warnings of raids, stolen livestock, burned homesteads. Her mouth went dry, but she forced herself to stand still. Running would only mark her as weak, and fear had never saved anyone on the frontier. She stepped forward, rifle in hand but pointed toward the ground. The riders slowed when they saw her. One of them raised a hand, palm outward, and guided his horse closer. He was older than the others, his hair threaded with gray, his face weathered and calm. "We need shelter," he said, his English rough but clear enough. Storm coming fast. As if summoned by his words, the wind picked up, tugging at Mara's skirt. She glanced toward the western sky. Dark clouds were gathering, thick and heavy, their edges bruised purple. She knew these storms well. When they broke violently, flooding dry washes and tearing roofs apart. 7 men caught in the open would not survive it. Her grip tightened on the rifle. Letting them stay could mean death. Turning them away could mean the same, for them, and perhaps for her later, if they chose to remember the refusal. "You bring trouble?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The man shook his head. "Only rain." The other riders waited silently, their eyes fixed on her. One of them stood out immediately, not because he was the tallest, though he was massive, but because he did not stare. His gaze moved over the land instead, as if reading it, understanding it. When his eyes finally met hers, there was no threat there. Only patience. She hesitated, weighing years of solitude against a storm that cared nothing for her fears. "Water first," she said at last. "Then we'll talk." Relief moved through the group in a subtle way, shoulders easing, tension releasing. They dismounted slowly, carefully, as if aware that one wrong move could shatter the fragile trust between them. Mara led them to the well, watching every step, every hand. She noticed how they treated her space with respect, how no one reached for a weapon or spoke over her. Thunder cracked overhead as the first drops of rain fell. By the time she ushered them inside, the storm had arrived in full fury. Rain hammered the roof like thrown stones, wind howled through the valley, and lightning flashed so bright it turned the world white for an instant at a time. Her small house filled quickly with bodies, heat, and the smell of wet leather. She had never shared the space with so many men before. The walls seemed to press inward, the ceiling lower than it had ever felt. Yet none of them crowded her. They waited for her direction, sitting where she gestured, speaking softly among themselves. The man she had noticed earlier took a place near the door, as if positioning himself between her and the storm, or perhaps between her and the others. He was younger than the leader but carried himself with quiet authority. Water dripped from his dark hair, tracing lines down his face and neck. When lightning flashed, she caught the strength in his features, the calm set of his mouth. Fear still lived in her chest, but it no longer screamed. It watched. Hours passed with the storm raging outside. At one point, a particularly violent clap of thunder made the walls shudder, and Mara flinched despite herself. The man by the door spoke then, a single word in his own language, low and soothing. She did not understand it, but the sound grounded her, like a hand placed gently at her back. She met his eyes, startled by the unexpected comfort. He held her gaze without challenge, without expectation. Something shifted in her chest, small and dangerous. Night fell heavy and dark. The storm showed no sign of easing, and Mara realized with a quiet jolt that they would be staying. She stirred a pot of beans over the fire, offering food she had meant to last the week. The men accepted it with murmured thanks, sharing among themselves before eating. They moved with an order that spoke of discipline, of shared experience. The leader introduced himself simply, then gestured toward the man near the door. Tahoma, he said. The name settled into her thoughts. Later, when most of the men slept, sprawled near the walls and hearth, Mara sat awake, listening to the rain. Tahoma remained alert, his back against the doorframe, eyes following the flicker of the firelight. When he spoke again, it was softly. You live here long time, he said. Yes. Alone. Yes. He nodded, as if that answer explained more than she could put into words. The storm roared on, relentless and wild. Outside, the valley was being reshaped by water and wind, old paths erased, new ones carved. Inside, Mara felt the unsettling sense that something within her was shifting too, quietly, irrevocably. She had opened her door to strangers, and with them, something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Uncertainty, and beneath it, a fragile, dangerous spark of connection she had sworn she no longer needed. Morning came slowly, filtered through heavy clouds that still clung low over the valley. The storm had lessened during the night, but the land outside looked wounded, as if it had been clawed open. Mud pooled where the earth had once been dry and cracked, and the wash behind the house roared with water that hadn't flowed there in years. Mara woke stiffly, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar sounds inside her home, breathing that was not her own, the soft shift of bodies, the faint crackle of dying embers in the hearth. For an instant, fear rose again, sharp and instinctive. Then memory settled in. The riders, the storm. She pushed herself up quietly, careful not to wake anyone. As she moved, she noticed how the men slept, boots lined neatly near the wall, weapons placed out of reach, horses' tacks set aside with care. There was no chaos here, no sense of invasion. Only temporary shelter. She stepped outside to assess the damage. The fence to the north had partially collapsed, several posts torn loose by rushing water. The lean-to roof sagged, one beam cracked. She sighed softly. Repairs would take days. Behind her, footsteps crunched in the wet earth. She turned to see Tahoma standing a short distance away, already awake. The morning light softened his features, but the strength in him remained unmistakable. He said nothing at first, simply followed her gaze to the broken fence. We help, he said. She hesitated. You don't have to. We stay because of storm, he replied calmly. We work because it is right. By the time the others rose, the decision had already been made. Without being told, they spread out, assessing damage, lifting fallen beams, gathering tools she rarely used herself. Mara watched from the doorway, unsure how to feel. She had spent years proving she needed no one. Now, 7 men were undoing that belief with every hammer strike and lifted post. The day passed in steady labor. Mud clung to boots, hands blistered, sweat mixed with rain, but no one complained. They worked with practiced coordination, communicating in brief phrases and gestures. Mara found herself drawn into the rhythm, handing tools, holding posts steady, moving alongside them instead of apart. Tahoma worked closest to her. He was careful not to crowd her, always asking with his eyes before stepping into her space. When she struggled to lift a beam too heavy for her alone, he wordlessly took the other end, their movements falling into sync. His presence was grounding, like a solid anchor in shifting ground. By afternoon, the clouds began to break apart, strips of pale blue showing through. The stormwater receded slowly, leaving the land dark and rich, almost unfamiliar in its fullness. When the work paused, Mara brought out what food she had: cornbread, dried meat, beans warmed again over the fire. They ate together under the open sky. Conversation was sparse but not uncomfortable. The older leader spoke occasionally, explaining that they had been returning from a trade that never came to pass, their route cut off by sudden weather. Others laughed softly among themselves, their voices low and warm. Mara found herself listening more than she spoke, surprised at how little she felt the need to retreat. Tahoma sat across from her, his attention often drifting back to her face, not in a way that made her uneasy, but curious, thoughtful. When their eyes met, he did not look away. That night, the sky cleared fully, stars spilling across the darkness in brilliant clusters. A small fire burned low outside, safer now that the wind had died. The men gathered around it, sharing stories in their language, voices rising and falling like music. Mara sat slightly apart, wrapped in a blanket, listening. Tahoma joined her after a while, settling at a respectful distance. The firelight danced across his features, casting shadows that made him look older, deeper somehow. You are not afraid now, he said. She considered the truth of it. I was, at first, and now, I don't know, she admitted. I don't think I know how to be afraid anymore. Or how not to be. He nodded slowly. Living alone teaches that. She glanced at him. You speak like you know. His eyes reflected the fire. I do. They fell into silence again, but it was a different kind than she was used to. It did not press against her ears or remind her of absence. It simply existed, shared. The second day passed much like the first. More repairs, more quiet cooperation. Mara noticed small things she hadn't expected, how they thanked the land before taking firewood, how they shared tasks without argument, how they never took more than they needed. Her old assumptions began to feel thin, worn out. That evening, as the others slept early, exhaustion finally claiming them, Mara and Tahoma remained awake by the dying fire inside the house. Rain had returned lightly, tapping at the roof like hesitant fingers. You asked why I live alone, she said suddenly. He looked at her, attentive. Yes, my husband left and never came back, she said. The words felt strange on her tongue, as if unused. After that, people felt temporary. Like storms. I decided it was easier not to wait for anyone again. Tahoma listened without interruption. When she finished, he spoke quietly. In my people, we say the heart is strong, but it is not meant to carry weight alone. She gave a small, humorless smile. Strength is what you do when there's no one else. Yes, he agreed, but it is not the same as peace. The truth of it settled between them. On the third morning, the valley felt calm again. Trails had dried enough to ride, and the men began preparing to leave. Horses were saddled, supplies gathered. Mara felt a tightness in her chest she hadn't anticipated, an unease she couldn't quite name. When they stood ready, the leader thanked her formally, placing his hand over his heart. The others followed suit. It felt ceremonial, meaningful. Tahoma lingered behind as the rest mounted. From a pouch at his side, he took out a small carved piece of bone, smooth and warm from being carried close to his body. He pressed it into her hand. For protection, he said. In memory, their fingers touched, and the contact sent a quiet tremor through her, not of fear, but of recognition. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile and heavy all at once. She swallowed. Safe travels. He nodded, his gaze holding hers a moment longer than necessary, then turned and mounted his horse. The 7 riders moved off together, fading into the land as if they had always belonged to it. Mara stood alone again, the token warm in her palm, the silence settling back around her. But it no longer felt empty. It felt like something had been left behind, something waiting. The quiet returned the moment the last rider disappeared beyond the ridge. It came gently at first, like a familiar guest hesitant at the doorway, then settled fully into the valley. The wind moved through the grass, the house creaked softly as it always had, and the land resumed its patient breathing. Everything looked the same, yet Mara felt as if something essential had been shifted just a few inches out of place. She stood there longer than necessary, the small carved token still resting in her palm. It was warm from her skin, smooth and solid, real in a way memory often was not. When she finally turned back toward the house, the silence followed her inside, but it no longer pressed against her chest. It lingered, observant, waiting. The days that followed were unsettled ones. Mara returned to her routines, mending, hauling water, checking the fences, but the rhythm felt altered. She caught herself listening for voices that were no longer there, glancing toward the horizon without meaning to. At night, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling while the memory of firelight and shared warmth replayed behind her eyes. She told herself it was foolish. 7 men passing through did not change a life. 1 man's quiet presence did not undo years of careful distance. She had built her solitude with intention, brick by brick, and she would not let a few days unravel it. Still, the land itself seemed changed. The storm had left the soil darker, richer. Wildflowers began to push through places that had been bare for years. Even the air felt fuller, carrying scents of wet earth and new growth. Mara wondered if the valley had been waiting for something too. A week passed, then another. She wore the token on a cord around her neck, telling herself it was only practical, a charm against bad luck, a reminder of kindness. But sometimes, when she touched it, she felt a quiet ache that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with absence. She spoke to no one, yet found herself rehearsing words in her mind as if she might need them suddenly. Words she hadn't used in years. Words meant for another person. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley gold, she heard hooves again. Her body reacted before her thoughts did. She straightened, heart racing, hand instinctively finding the rifle. But this time, the sound was different. Lighter, singular. 1 rider crested the ridge. He rode slowly, deliberately, not trying to surprise her. Even from a distance, she recognized him. The way he sat his horse. The calm certainty in his movements. Tahoma. She stood frozen, unsure whether to breathe. He dismounted well before reaching the house, leaving his horse waiting behind him, and approached on foot with open hands. He stopped several paces away, respecting the space she had claimed as her own. I did not come for shelter, he said. Her voice caught before she could stop it. Then why are you here? He looked past her for a moment, toward the house, the valley, the land stretching wide and open. When his eyes returned to her, they held no urgency, no demand. I came because I did not leave everything behind. The truth of his words settled into her slowly. She lowered the rifle, setting it against the wall. You could have ridden anywhere, she said. Why come back here? Because some places are not just ground, he replied. They are choices. They stood facing one another in the long light of evening, the silence between them alive but not heavy. Mara realized then that she was not afraid. Not of him, not of what his return might mean. The fear she felt was quieter, deeper, the fear of opening a door she had kept closed for so long she had forgotten what lay on the other side. You don't know what staying would be like, she said carefully. This life is hard, lonely. I know loneliness, Tahoma said. And I know when it is shared, it changes shape. She studied his face, searching for uncertainty, for expectation. She found none. He was not asking to be saved. He was offering himself honestly, without promise or pressure. Would you stay as long as you wished? She asked. Yes. And leave if I asked you to? He nodded. Yes. The simplicity of it undid her more than any grand declaration could have. Then you can stay, she said at last. But this place, it isn't owned. It's lived in, together or not at all. A slow smile spread across his face, deep and quiet, as if he had hoped but not assumed. That is enough. That night, they shared a meal in near silence, the kind that felt natural rather than strained. Tahoma spoke of his people, of roads that shifted with seasons, of learning when to stay and when to move on. Mara spoke of the years alone, of learning the land's moods, of building something meant only for herself. They did not speak of love. They did not need to. Days turned into weeks. Tahoma helped with the work, not as a guest, but as a partner. They fell into patterns that felt surprisingly easy, shared labor, shared rest, quiet evenings by the fire. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they said nothing at all. The valley bore witness to it all, unchanged and yet transformed. At night, he slept near the door at first, honoring an unspoken boundary. Later, when the distance between them no longer felt necessary, they shared the same space, warmth replacing the cold that had once defined her nights. Their closeness was slow, deliberate, built on trust rather than urgency. Mara found herself laughing more, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. She caught herself imagining things she had not allowed before, seasons passing with another presence, the house bearing more signs of life, the land remembered not only for survival but for shared memory. One evening, as they watched the sunset bleed into the hills, Tahoma spoke softly. "You are not alone because you were weak," he said. "You were alone because you survived." She leaned into his shoulder, resting her head there without hesitation. "And now," he said, "you are choosing something more." The wind moved through the grass, carrying the promise of change without threat. The house stood steady, its walls holding not just one life, but two intertwined paths. Mara realized then that solitude had taught her strength, but connection had given it meaning. And for the first time in many years, the future did not feel like an empty stretch of land. It felt like home.